Hey everybody, it's Gwyneth again, and I'm going to talk to you about dynamic range. The technical definition of dynamic range is the ratio between the maximum light intensity measurable versus the minimum light intensity measurable. The less newsworthy definition of dynamic range is the ratio between the widest or brightest part of your image versus the darkest or blackest part of your image. The units of measurement for dynamic range is actually f-stops. The better quality your camera makes for the better dynamic range. For example, a good dynamic range is having a true black and a true white and a wide range of midtones between the two. An example of a poor quality dynamic range is having a true black and a true white with a very narrow range of midtones between the two. Alright, let's look at examples of scenes that will require a wide dynamic range versus a narrow dynamic range. An example of a scene that would require a wide dynamic range would be a sunset or a sunrise. In this scenario, you have a huge variation between deep dark shadows versus bright sun rays. An example of a scene that would require a narrow dynamic range would be a cloudy landscape. In this scenario, you have less contrast between the brights and the darks in your image. To give you a little perspective, the human eye has a dynamic range of 24 f-stops, whereas a typical camera will have a dynamic range between 10 and 15 f-stops at their native ISO. This is how the picture would appear to the human eye. This is how the picture would appear to a camera. When the slider goes up, we lose detail in the blacks. When the slider goes down, we lose detail in the whites. This is an example of the limitations of your camera's dynamic range. Your typical video camera that doesn't have the ability to shoot in log will have a dynamic range of around 10 f-stops, whereas your high-end cinema cameras will have a dynamic range of around 15 f-stops when they're shooting in log. A very basic explanation of log is that it's a color profile that compresses the dynamic range in an image that can be later graded to increase the natural dynamic range of the camera. Don't worry if you don't have a thorough understanding of log right now. We will go more in depth in a future episode. Alright, let's talk about cameras and how they measure light. Cameras use an array of millions of little cavities that capture light. These are called photosites or photo sensing sites. These photosites are located on the camera sensors and they're used to record an image. For every pixel in an image, you have one photosite. For example, my Sony a7R II has an output of 42.4 megapixels. Therefore, each image that it takes, it has 42.4 million pixels, which means that the camera has to have 42.4 million photosites on its sensor. Upon pressing the shutter release button on your camera, or the button that you use to take the picture, these photosites are exposed and collect light in the form of photons. These photons are then stored in the form of electrical signals. The shutter speed at which you set your camera to determines how long these photosites are exposed to that light. The longer those photosites are exposed to light, the more photons they collect. The shorter amount of time they're exposed to that light, the less photons they collect. I keep throwing around this word photons, so let's go back to physics class and discuss what photons are. Photons are particles that represent a quantum of light. Upon the closure of your shutter, also again determined by your shutter speed, your photosites are closed and your camera measures the number of photons each has collected by looking at the electrical signal emitted by each. These electrical signals are then quantified into digital values. If a photosite does not contain any photons, your camera will register that as a pure black pixel. If a photosite contains numerous photons, your camera will register that as a pure white pixel. So think of a photosite as a bucket, much like a bucket holding water. The wider the dynamic range, the deeper the bucket. Alright, let's talk about ways that we monitor dynamic range. A histogram shows the distribution of light in your image from shadows, midtones, to highlights, as well as the range of tones in your image. Since we like to use buckets as examples, think of your histogram as a horizontal bucket of light. Any light spilling out of the left side of the histogram will be underexposed and will show up as pure black. Any light spilling out the right side of your histogram will be overexposed and will appear as pure white. So it's very important to control our exposure and make sure our light remains in that bucket. If light is spilling out on both the right as well as the left sides of your histogram, that means you have exceeded the dynamic range of your camera. Alright, there are two ways in order to enhance the dynamic range of your camera. The first is to shoot in RAW for photography, and if your camera has the capability, to shoot in RAW for film. But if it doesn't, you can use log. Although some low-end cameras don't have the ability to shoot in either RAW or log. The second is to shoot in HDR or high dynamic range for photography. A basic definition of what HDR is shooting identical shots at different varying exposures, from underexposed to overexposed, and then taking all of those shots and merging them in post. Although some cameras are awesome and include an HDR setting in camera, so it will do it for you. Okay everybody, that wraps it up for my class on photography. We'll see you next week.